Hi, this is Paul, and today I'm going to show you how to create a realistic iris texture in BCC 8 using Organic Strands. Okay, so here I am with the finished product. You can see it's a static iris texture, which you could use for animation or just freaking out your neighbors. And I'm going to show you in future tutorials how to do even cooler things with this, like parent the pupil so it can dilate and put it onto 3D objects. But this is just going to show you how to create this nice texture. Alright, so let's delete all the hard work I did there and start anew. So I'd like to start by looking at an actual iris, courtesy of the internet. And if you look closely at it, you can see all these muscle fibers here, which make up the pattern we're used to in an iris. I'm going to call them strands, because that's what they look like. And you can see that the noise pattern in the strands is similar but varied. The color is similar but varied, and the opacity is similar but varied. Alright, kind of a theme there. We definitely want them to start thin and dark and get stronger in the middle and then fade out again towards the sclera, if I'm pronouncing that right. I hope so. Alright, so another thing before I get started I want to point out, no two eyes are the same. So whatever I show you here is advice, and I encourage you to play around with it, try similar but different things, and if you think you got something really cool, you know, maybe post it online. That would be fun. Alright, so starting, new comp, new solid. I'm going to call this iris, and just going to go ahead and apply BCC Organic Strands. You can see this is a very true to form filter here. It is in fact made of organic looking strands. The first thing we want to do is turn down that wiggliness, go into organic noise, set the auto evolve speed to 0. Now they're not so wiggly. Great. Next, go into the source group, change the shape from sphere to point. This is important if you're just doing a 2D object. If you're doing a 3D object, you could actually do this whole thing as a sphere, but we're doing 2D today. Next, go into the strands group, change the direction of the strands from outward to fan outward. That gives them a nice flattened radial appearance. And if you increase the count, you can see an iris-like pattern emerging already. Hey, it's like we're almost done, but we're not. Okay, next we have to start shaping the particles and the strands themselves. So first thing I want to do is twirl down the opacity graph and draw in here. You can customize the opacity of the strands there so we can see them all. When it's like this, the edges of the strands are actually transparent. So while we're setting it up, it's crucial to see where the strands actually are. And we're definitely going to have to shorten the strands if they're going to fit in our project. Making use of the Control hotkey as I scrub to get smoother, smaller changes there. And I think that'll be good. Okay, now creating a space for the pupil can be done a few ways. I like to do it using the movement group. If you increase the move progress, you can actually spread out the strands and just create a gap for the pupil there. Again, we want to make sure we keep our strands within our project size, but we also want the pupil to be about a third, maybe of the size of the eye. So that looks good, but now we have to shorten the strands again. Sometimes you might get these little stragglers out there. If you turn down the spread, that can help reduce that. And if it still doesn't quite go away, you can just decrease the length a little bit more or turn down the noise. The organic noise also has this random bend parameter, which if you turn it all the way off to 0, you can actually even out the strands quite a bit, make like a nice CD graphic or DVD or Blu-ray or whatever the next thing will be. But I think just a little bit more noise for the iris. 250 looks good. Next, go into the source group and increase the source noise suppression parameter. This is cool. It flattens out the strands towards the origin, which is just like what happens in a real eye. I love how that works so well. Okay, so that's about the length and size of everything. So let's go back into the strands group and thin these out. They're way too thick. Alright, I'd say about 7 is good. And if you get to a point where you can see the particles in the strands, no problem, just increase the density. About 320, I think. There we go. And our final result's probably going to be somewhere around 2,000. So let's go to 1,200 particles for now. Strands. I keep calling them particles. That's how I think of them. Anyway, so yeah, we can see this is a pretty good thickness for the end result. I don't want to work with that many, so I'll just turn it down to 600, and that's still a good impression of the end result. Alright, now let's color these strands. You have a lot of different options here. You can change just one color for all strands. You get some nice blending going on, which is available to you in the particles group. In version 8.2 and higher of this filter, you can change to lighten and screen now. Screen is actually quite useful for an iris, so I am going to use that. If you're following along but you have a version older than 8.2, you might not have those. So upgrade. Alright, there's the sales pitch. So, this is nice, but it's not the color I want. I'm going to use a gradient. And if you scroll down here, you can see our gradient editor. We give you a few presets to get started, maybe some grays or blues or what have you. And I do want the eye to be blue, but not like cartoony blue. I'm going to make it kind of a bluish green. And if you remember, the iris starts dark and gets more saturated towards the middle. So this is going to be much the same. You actually don't need all these colors, so you can turn off the ones that you don't need. I do find you can get a little bit better results if you do use more of the colors, but if you're in a time crunch and you just really don't need it, why not? Okay, so that's looking pretty good. This one is way too bright. Okay, so if I put this on a checkerboard background, I can see how it really looks. And I'm wondering if that pupil is too big. I think it is. So I'm going to bring it in a little bit and extend the length to compensate just a bit more. Perfect. Okay. Alright, now we can start playing around with these opacity graphs and even a taper graph. So we want it to be transparent on both ends, and we can thin it out a bit. Maybe turn this down a bit for now. Get faster updates. And like so. Alright, that looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit stronger at the end. This is another way you can actually control the length of your particles if one is too long. Strands! Man, I keep doing that. The length of your strands. But that's pretty good for me. Next, let's change the taper of the strands. And this is another graph control. And it should more or less follow the opacity. Maybe smaller changes though. Because the thinner they get, remember, the more the particles will show up and you'd have to increase the density again. Okay, so far so good. Maybe just a little bit more like that. Sure. And I think that's good for a base. We're going to make more changes to this as we go, but let's move on. So I'm going to layer this with another iris effect. I'm going to call this Iris 2. And this is going to be like the darker fringe around the iris. To make it visibly different, I'm just going to change the color temporarily. Shorten the length by a lot. And what I'm going to do here is move it backwards. That's so the length is headed inwards towards the center and not outwards towards the edges. And why would I do that, you might ask? Well, it's so when I increase the length, they grow inward. And on top of that, if I want to use length variance, they'll also do that inwardly rather than outwardly. Okay, looks good. I do want to change the noise and the opacity here. So just switch that around. Same thing with the taper. And going back into the noise, this could be maybe a little less noisy or a little more, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to change the noise character to spiky, then turn that down. Looks good. And now let's put the color we want in there. So this is going to be a little bit darker. Just get rid of some of these colors and take out the saturation for them. And increase the particle count there too. Alright, looking a little bit desaturated and also a little bit bright. There we go. Okay, and I can smooth out the rest using the opacity graph again. Soften it up. Looks good. Okay, so again we'll increase the full numbers for the final render. Next I'm going to create another little semi-ring around the iris, and this is going to be like this strong area before the pupil. If I'm basing this off this eye here, you can see how they seem to get darker after that point. So I'm going to change the colors in this gradient so they do the same thing. Alright, it's getting ahead of myself though. Let's just duplicate that, push it up. Call this Iris 3. Turn down the count, and to make it visible once more, change the color. These are going to be very short, and we're going to push them out just about there. And these are going to have very different noise. Because there's so few of them, we can turn up the noise a little bit more, make them a little bit longer. Change the pattern to spiky, turn down the count, maybe change the bend Y and X, and the frequency. That looks good. You don't have to do noise per particle. If you turn that off, you can apply like a general noise field across the whole thing. But I like how that looks. Alright, now let's increase the density, change the color. These I will leave as one color because they're just kind of like a boundary area. A little less saturated, a little bit shorter, and more variance in the opacity. That looks pretty good. Same thing with the taper. Yeah. Okay. I don't even need them to be that thick. Alright, good. So now that we have that boundary area, let's make sure the strands are darker beyond it. Looks like they pretty much are. I'm just going to double check by seeing if this color, well, that's already black, so that one's good. This one can be a little darker. There we go. And the one right after it can be a little brighter to compensate, maybe. Yeah, to sort of give that idea that something's falling in there. And now that I see how these look on top of that, I think I might change the opacity of the whole layer so it blends in a little better, like so. Again, remember this is still over nothing, so don't take the results over black too literally yet. Okay, next we're going to add a background and our specular highlights. So the background, I have a nice little way I like to do it. Just call it white in the back, spelled in a very whimsical fashion. So let's do a ramp on here, radial ramp. Line up the center point with the pupil, the edge with about the edge there. Now let's add a fractal noise pattern to it. We're just going to change it to multiply and turn down the opacity and scale it down as well. And on top of the fractal noise, we're going to add the tritone effect. I like the one from BCC because it gives me the ability to do repeats and move the midpoint. So I'm going to go to about 2 repeats there. Definitely bring down these colors so they're more consistent with my background. And that doesn't have to be pure black. Dark, but you know, it doesn't have to be pure black there. And you know, by changing the repeat amount, you can get some really cool patterns there. You can also move where the midpoint is, like so. This is ultimately just so the iris is on top of something. Okay, and that looks good. And now we're going to create a mask so it stays within the bounds of the iris. Again, you want to make sure it just covers all of the strands there. Feather it just a tiny bit for now. Maybe a little bit more. And if it goes too far in one direction, you can always just expand it out. Okay, so now we have something that our iris is actually on top of. Next, we're going to add the specular highlight. And to do that, I like to cheat and just use the sphere effect and use the specular highlight that comes with that filter. So you can use the built-in sphere that comes with After Effects. I'll just use the BCC one because I can. Turn off drop shadow, turn on the light. Oh, it's already on. Well, turn on the specular light and set the apply mode to normal. Turn down the intensity of light 1 because all we need is the specular. And there it is. And we can just rotate it around to where it needs to be. Of course, this whole pupil needs to be scaled down to fit about where it has to go there. I'm going to go a bit beyond because we're not going to use the edge of this circle as the edge of the pupil because pupils don't have hard edges. Again, if you look carefully at here, you can see kind of a rough edge. Again, in this one, a very soft edge. It's even irregular. So it shouldn't really be like a perfect hard edge sphere. And I'm going to eat into that edge using a radial wipe. The reason I'm using a radial wipe filter is because it lets me use a noise pattern on the edge. And it's radial for obvious reasons. Okay, so eating into it a good amount there. Take the pattern and set it to noise. That's a bit much, so we're going to bring it down like so. Increase the softness maybe, just a tad. And there we go. Even that's a bit much. Turn it down. Okay, good. Alright, now, before we go on to the last part of the shading, let's increase the strand count and make sure we got what we think we got here. So the base, I'm going to put all the way up to about 2,000. And the edge, I'm going to push up to 1,000 as well. 1,000, not 100. Okay, so even before I do anything more, I'm going to push this one out a bit because I want to make sure it covers all of the background. And when I see it on the background, I decide that it's actually a little too dark for my taste. So I'm going to bring everything back up a bit. Actually, I like that part, but not the other parts. So this one should be a bit higher. Gives it a nice, more blended look. looks good. This background here, I'm thinking it's too dark on the fractal noise, so maybe I'll increase the brightness, or rather just drop the opacity. Maybe bring up the colors in the tritone. And I'm doing this all by changing swatches. You could actually do it with color effects, like a color grade filter. And that's looking pretty good. It seems to be a lot of white space around the edge there, so if I can't get rid of that by increasing the count on this particle instance, which I might be able to do, I might just have to shrink that edge a bit more, like so. Okay, now we're going to add a couple of other catch lights on the eye to really complete the effect. Actually, before I do that, let me just fix this one specular light. It's a bit too big, so increase the fall off there and move it out. Now, duplicating the pupil effect, I'm just going to delete the radial wipe and increase this sphere, the scale of it, so it fits over the eye, and then adjust the light so that now it fits as a catch light. And if that's too intense, you can always turn it down. This whole layer is going to be set to add. And then you just put it around where it looks nice. Turn down the intensity a bit. Now this is a cheat that I do in 2D textures. If you were using this in an actual 3D environment, I would probably not do this part and let your scene lights take over for that kind of thing. But it's a really nice cheat and it's really easy to do. You can even do up to 3 lights in one of these filters, so why not? Put another one here. I'm going to let this one stay sharp. Just move it off to the side, like so. And because of that catch light, it looks like it's hiding this level a little bit, so I'll just boost the thickness there so they're visible again. And that whole layer, let's make that an add as well. Whoa, too much screen. There we go. Alright, and there you have a iris texture created in BCC in After Effects. So stay tuned for future tutorials where I'll show you how to parent parameters and make the pupil dilate and how to connect this to a 3D object. So tune in for more at borisfx.com.